What's the scariest story you know to be completely true? Story 1. My cousin picked up a hitchhiker about 20 years ago. He seemed like a nice enough guy. My cousin was hungry, so he stopped at McDonald's and even grabbed the hitchhiker some breakfast. He dropped him off where the man said he was headed. No big deal. The next morning, my cousin was watching the news and saw that same hitchhiker's face. The man was a serial killer who had murdered someone that picked him up. My cousin called the police and they had him come in. It turned out that the hitchhiker had killed the very next person who gave him a ride. He had killed several people who offered him rides. That was his method of operation. When the police asked him why he didn't kill my cousin, he said that he had planned to but couldn't go through with it because my cousin was a really nice young man who had bought him breakfast. He said he couldn't kill someone who bought him breakfast. Story 2, I worked with kids in foster care. A 17-year-old girl once told her court-appointed special advocate that she had a secret. We had a school assault response team for situations like this because, sadly, in the foster system, it often involved rape. But this time was different. She sat down and told us that her family was part of a cartel and her cousins were enforcers. One day when she was around 8 years old, her cousins picked her up and took her out to the desert where they had a 5-year-old boy. They made her choke him to death. He was the child of a family that owed them money, usually for being smuggled across the border. We had no plan for something like that. The police said there was no body and no crime because there were no details to verify. And the cousins she could name were either dead, out of the country, or already in prison. That poor girl confessed that she had been forced to kill a child with her bare hands and nothing came of it. No justice for her, the boy, or his family. Just a shrug and a, guess it happens. A year later, she turned 18 and left the system to face a world she knew was nothing like what we claim it to be. Story 3. When I was a kid, there was a peeping Tom in our neighborhood. The strange part was that we all knew who he was. An older guy named Ralph who lived a couple of streets over and smoked constantly. Everyone knew because he had once been caught by a neighbor while standing on their roof, watching through their skylight. After that, he became like a ghost. Impossible to catch. People would find footprints and cigarette butts outside their windows, smell cigarette smoke, or see the red glow of a cigarette in the woods. Angry fathers and teenagers tried to chase him, but he moved like a deer and always got away. The police were involved a few times and brought him in, but never for long, probably because he was the sole caretaker for his disabled wife. He became a sort of neighborhood boogeyman, creepy but mostly harmless. Years later, there were a series of break-ins nearby. People joked that it couldn't be Ralph because we figured he already had keys to everyone's houses. Later, we learned that he actually did. One night, a neighbor heard a commotion and ran outside to find a man beaten up and lying in the driveway. The police identified him as a burglar who had items from the break-ins in his car and apartment. When they asked him what happened, he said he was attacked from behind and never saw his attacker. The only thing he remembered was that the man smelled strongly of cigarette smoke. Story 4. This one is personal. My family and I were staying in a rental house for a few months because my dad was terrible with money. The house belonged to a wealthy friend of his who was going through a divorce after his wife developed a serious substance problem. We were living there pretty cheaply. One night near Christmas, I woke up groggily and saw a woman in white going through the drawers on the other side of the room. I must have made a sound because she rushed over and softly said, "Shh, go back to sleep, little boy." Strangely, I did. She looked kind of like Liza Minnelli, if that matters. The next morning, I woke up to my parents acting strangely and heard one of them say, "I can't tell what's gone and what's not." I didn't connect the dots at the time and never told them what I had seen. I thought it was a dream. Later, I realized the truth. The former substance-addicted owner of our rental house had broken in, probably using a spare key. I saw her that night but did nothing. I must have been around 9 years old. Story 5. My family literally had a party to die for. We hosted a very late Christmas party in March and invited a few neighbors, including an older couple. Aside from a few odd comments from the husband, like, "I'm so glad I could have one last good meal," everyone had a great time. People kept saying how amazing the food and the party were. The old couple left a bit earlier than the rest, and we didn't think much of it. About an hour later, another guest came rushing back inside, yelling about police and medics on our street. It turned out the husband had collapsed and died about 30 minutes after they got home. To be fair, he had been in poor health, and everyone knew his time was limited, but none of us thought it would happen that soon. Story 6. My high school girlfriend called late one night after I was home and in bed. She said that something had happened and asked if I could come over. She was clearly shaken and not full of details, so I told my parents and drove over towards her house. At the top of her subdivision, I was met by a police officer with his lights on. He asked where I was going, and I told him about the call from my girlfriend. He let me go by, and as I came over the hill to the cul-de-sac where she lived, I saw multiple police cars surrounding the circle. They watched me pull up and get out of my car. My girlfriend came running out of her house and met me in the street. She explained that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started beating her with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and ran to my girlfriend's home, banging furiously on the front door. My girlfriend's dad was out of town, so her mom answered the door, and the neighbor fell into the foyer, bleeding profusely from the head. Her mom looked up to see the attacker walking up the path toward the house. She pulled the injured neighbor inside and slammed the door shut, hitting the attacker with it before it fully closed. He then took the heavy tool he had used to beat the neighbor and smashed the small window at the top of the door. Her mom screamed, and the attacker just turned around and walked away into the darkness. I spent the night there that night, along with 2 or 3 police officers sitting outside in their cars. And in the morning, we could see blood still pooled on the floor in the foyer and splattered above the front door, where the attacker had swung the bloody tool to smash the window. No one was ever caught or even identified. It was completely random. The neighbor survived, and as far as I know, she didn't have any permanent physical injuries beyond scarring from having her scalp stapled shut. She moved away shortly after the incident. Story 7. A close friend of my family, a single young woman, back in the 1980s, bought her first house. It was a small house in a quiet neighborhood, like most were in my town. So, she was moving in her one small moving truck's worth of stuff. It was a nice summer day, and most of the neighbors saw this and came over to introduce themselves. Anyway, as the story goes, it was warm, summer, and there was no air conditioning. You could get houses without air conditioning back then, so she had the windows all open to let some breeze through. Now it's night, and she's absolutely exhausted from the move. She walks into her back bedroom and flops onto her bed. All the lights were on in the front living room and kitchen area, but she didn't turn them on in the bedroom. She said she was just going to rest for a few minutes before getting back to putting stuff away, but she fell asleep. She said she didn't know how long it was, but she woke up to a sound. Then she realized what it was once she got her bearings. Someone was slowly and quietly cutting the screen out of that window with a razor blade. Afterward, we all assumed that the person planned to enter the dark part of the house quietly, thinking she was still up in the lit part, and lie in wait for her. She sat up in bed and yelled, "I have my Magnum right here next to me, and if you don't get out, I'll shoot," or something close to that. She said she heard the footsteps of whoever it was running away as fast as they could, which was lucky for her because she didn't have a gun at all. She didn't even have phone service hooked up to the house yet, and no cell phones in the 1980s for most people. She had successfully bluffed her way out of who knows what. I've heard a lot of scary true stories in my life, but this one has stuck with me ever since I was a teenager. In that moment, she took her one shot, and it worked. Story 8. This will probably be buried, and that's fine. When I graduated from college in the early 1990s, I got a job as a high school teacher. I made $29,000 a year. I loved it, but I had to work a summer job to pay the bills. During that summer job, I broke up a fight between several teenagers. No big deal. The police arrived, and one officer said to me, "Bro, why are you wasting your time teaching? You could work for us and make double with all the overtime." He added, "And it's not like you'll ever have to use your gun. And if you do, it won't be someone you know or care about." I had bills and debt, so a year later, I became a young patrol officer. In my mind, it was just a way to pay for graduate school. Student loans like today didn't exist yet. One day I got a call for backup. A suspect wanted for homicide had taken an immigrant family hostage. I raced to get there. When I arrived, a sergeant told me, "Come with me. We'll take the backyard position in case he flees out the back." As we entered the yard, the suspect was already running toward the fence. He turned and, like something out of an action movie, fired several shots. He hit 2 officers, me included. I returned fire and hit him with all 4 shots I fired. That was the day I killed my childhood best friend. We had been inseparable in elementary school. He had moved away, but we still met up every couple of years. I hadn't seen him for 5 years before that night, and every single day of my life since. I think about him and his warm smile. Every single day. I'm so sorry, Jose. Story 9. I was once doing criminology research in High Blantyre, a small town in Scotland just outside Glasgow. It was a rough place in those days, and we had to sit in a car all night counting people walking down a dark alley and recording any crimes we saw. Spoiler, we didn't see any crimes. A few months later, after they fitted some streetlights, we came back to do it again to see if anything had changed. The car was parked in front of a pub. One night while we sat there, we failed to notice a group of gangsters enter the pub, shoot a man in the back of the head while he was standing at the bar, drag him into the back room, chop him into pieces, stuff him into black bags, and carry him off to be disposed of. My friend Harry and I, sitting there with our clipboards, recorded no crimes. We weren't the only ones. Not a single person drinking in the pub that night claimed to have seen anything either. Later, they found his arm in a sewer, and his wife and her boyfriend were arrested for arranging his murder. If that wasn't insane enough, I discovered later that they were both driving instructors at the same company where I had taken lessons, just 100 yards from my house in the center of Glasgow, 20 miles away from that pub. She had taught Harry's sister, and he had taught me. Story 10. When I was 13 or 14, I got into play-by-post role-playing. It was on the forums section of the official Harry Potter website, which is kind of funny looking back. We didn't play as students or anything. It was all original characters and took place in a bar. The leader of the group was a very talented writer. We started talking outside the roleplay and eventually connected on MSN Messenger. He was my first real internet friend. We found out that we both lived in Minnesota, not far from each other, but we never met in person. We got to know each other really well over about 2 years. He was a year older than me, but incredibly smart and creative. He spoke well, knew things way beyond what most kids our age did, and made impressive flash animations. Stick figure death animations were really popular back then. He lived with his grandmother because his mom was an alcoholic and his dad had died. He often talked about being bullied and how bad his home life was. Once he told me he had said to his grandma that he wanted to kill himself, and her only response was to do it outside so he wouldn't make a mess in the house. We talked constantly and became close friends. Sometimes he'd disappear for a week or two because of depression, but he always came back, until he didn't. One afternoon, breaking news came on the television. There had been a school shooting in his town. I immediately knew who it was, even before the news announced it. He had killed his grandfather and his grandfather's girlfriend, fellow students, teachers, and then himself. The Federal Bureau of Investigation came to my house in the following weeks and questioned me, but I had no idea about his plans. They took my computer to examine our conversations. I grieved privately, but he will forever be remembered as a school shooter. That's the most terrifying thing I've ever been connected to. Story 11. I once read a journal my great-grandfather wrote when he was 16 years old, serving in the First World War in the trenches with the Newfoundland Division. He was one of the many kids who lied about their age to get in. Because Newfoundland wasn't part of Canada at the time, all of the Newfoundlanders had to wear reflective metal triangles on their uniforms so the Canadians and the British could tell who they were. He said it basically made them moving targets because the sun would reflect off them. One entry in particular has always stayed with me. Every day is different in the trench, but every day is also the same. The scent of mud water is lodged so far into my sinuses that I don't believe I'll ever smell anything else. I've seen things no man should ever see in his life. I'm scared. George is scared. It seems there are bullets all around us. And fire. For the love of all holy God, the fire. Lord, if I should die, please don't let it be by fire. We're going over the trenches today. Lord, please let me come back safely. Please don't let me die by fire. For the love of God, I miss my mother. I miss my father. That entry was written right before my great-grandfather, and over 300 other Newfoundlanders were ordered to go up over no man's land to shoot the opposing soldiers and then run back to safety. He was one of only 4 men to make it back alive. His childhood friend George, whose hand he was holding so they wouldn't lose each other on the way back, almost made it but was shot near the trench. My great-grandfather dragged him into a crater and had to leave him there. As far as he knew, George bled out because he never saw him again, though part of him hoped he hadn't been burned by the flamethrowers, what he called the fire. Story 12. I was living in a high-rise building on the 15th floor. I got home from morning yoga just as the sun was coming up, and there was an ambulance and a fire truck in the driveway, but no lights or sirens. I went into the lobby to take the elevator up to my floor and overheard a police officer on his phone saying, "Nobody knows where he fell or jumped from." Being the morbid person I am, I went straight up to my apartment and out onto the balcony. I scanned the pool deck and didn't see anything at first until I looked straight down and saw a man lying there, clearly dead for hours, staring up at me. There wasn't as much blood as I would have expected. A few weeks later, I ran into one of the building employees and asked if he knew what had happened. He showed me the security footage of the man falling to his death. The guy had lived just a few floors below me in an identical apartment. He had gone out drinking with friends to celebrate a recent promotion. The footage showed his friends leaving around 2 o'clock. Around 2:20, he went out onto his balcony and, for some unknown reason, stood on a table that slipped out from under him, causing him to fall backward over the railing and drop about 6 stories onto the pool deck. A couple having coffee on their balcony a few floors below spotted him at sunrise. He died on impact and had been lying there for nearly 4 hours before anyone realized. Story 13. My brother and I were racing on rollerblades outside our apartment complex, down the alley toward the street. He beat me there, and when I arrived, he was talking to a stranger walking on the sidewalk. My brother looked at me and said, "Let's go ask Mom, come on," and ran inside with me following right behind. He started begging my mom to go help this man find his lost puppy. We followed her outside, but the man was already gone. A week later, a neighbor kid from the house across the street was abducted. His little brother had been playing in the front yard when a car pulled up, and the man inside called him over, saying something about a puppy. The man tried to grab the younger boy, but the older brother ran to help. The kidnapper let go of the little one and pulled the older boy into the car instead. He was only 10 years old. The kidnapper turned out to be Joseph Edward Duncan, a convicted serial killer. It's chilling to think it could have been my brother instead. Always teach your kids not to talk to strangers and to come get you before going anywhere with them. The chances may be slim, but the world can be a sick place, and it might just save their life. Story 14. A guy I used to work with, who was in his early 30s in great shape, didn't drink or smoke, and always showed up to work with a smile and an almost annoyingly positive outlook on life, was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer that was difficult to cure. He was very open about his lifestyle, proud that he didn't smoke or drink, deeply into music, and worked out every day. He was the exact picture of someone you'd expect to live a long, healthy life. The chemotherapy reduced him to a frail, bald shell of his former self for several months, but he still came into work a few times in a wheelchair to keep us updated. Eventually, the cancer went into remission, and he told everyone the good news. He was still pale and thin, but he slowly gained strength and was able to walk again. His social media posts were full of gratitude, thankful to be alive, to enjoy food again, and to play music like he loved to. But exactly 1 year after remission, the cancer came back, more aggressive than ever, and it killed him. He was as kind and innocent as they come, just a genuinely happy-go-lucky guy. He was brave and gave cancer a real fight for a couple of years. Rest in peace, my friend. And seriously, F cancer. That absolute fing monster. Story 15. My elementary school teacher, Grace, and her husband, Matt, adopted 3 children, Jesse, Ezra, and Gloria. The family later moved to Qatar because Matt got a job there through his engineering firm. Gloria, having grown up in severe poverty and hunger before being adopted, struggled with a serious eating disorder. Sometimes she would refuse to eat for days, and other times she would binge and even dig through the trash for food. While in Qatar, Gloria suddenly and unexpectedly died, and an autopsy determined that she had died of starvation. Grace and Matt were arrested and charged with murder. They went through a long, confusing, and devastating trial during which Jesse and Ezra were placed in an orphanage. After nearly 2 years, the charges were dropped, and they were finally allowed to return home to California. What makes this story so terrifying to me is how personal it felt. Grace was my teacher, a kind, gentle woman who cared deeply for every student she taught. After our school year with her ended, she got married, and she and Matt went to Australia for their honeymoon. While there, she wrote postcards to every single one of her former students, and even brought each of us a stuffed animal souvenir, which we picked up the following school year, when she was no longer our teacher. When I saw her name on the news years later, my heart stopped. I can't imagine what horrors she and Matt went through, or what really happened, but I hope they and their children have found peace and healing after such unimaginable tragedy. Story 16. When I was in university, one of our neighbors went missing. There were search efforts for about a week, and then everything went quiet. A few months later, when we were all moving out of student housing, we started noticing a terrible smell near our back porch. It smelled like something dead. We asked his roommates about it, but they thought it was just from their poor cleaning habits. They admitted that the smell was even worse inside their house. It turned out that the missing neighbor had been there all along. Their house was a duplex with a shared basement that was supposed to be locked, but the man had found a way in and had hung himself down there. He had been there for months, and no one checked because the basement was believed to be inaccessible. His body had decomposed so badly that he eventually fell from where he had been hanging, and that's when the smell finally spread enough for people to notice. I'm just grateful they eventually found him, but I still hope someone was held accountable for not searching the basement of the very house where he lived. Story 17. When I was in 3rd or 4th grade, I used to take the school bus home every day. One afternoon, I noticed a man standing on the sidewalk, wearing sunglasses, a hat, a goatee, and a hoodie, just staring at the bus as we passed. It creeped me out a little, but I didn't think much of it until the next day. That day it was raining hard, and I saw the same man again, this time holding an umbrella. Same clothes, same stance, just watching the bus. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was a parent waiting for a kid, but then I saw him again, 2 or 3 stops down the route, and again a few stops after that. The bus route made it almost impossible for someone to appear at that many stops by coincidence, and he was watching the bus every single time. For whatever reason, I didn't tell an adult, though it started to bother me more each day. Eventually, I told my mom, who contacted the school. By then, other kids had already reported seeing the same man. The school contacted the police, who later told us that the man had been arrested for attempting to kidnap a child and had only recently been released from prison for kidnapping and child abuse. I learned my lesson about speaking up after that. It came in handy that summer when some creep in a minivan tried to tell me he was my dad's friend and was supposed to pick me up to go get food. Story 18. I am 17 years old and attend a relatively small school in a village in the south of the United Kingdom. Sometimes our school invites external speakers to give assemblies on different topics. It's usually something dull, like a local police officer talking about road safety. But last Friday we were joined by Letlapa Mfahlele. He came to speak about apartheid in South Africa and the concept of forgiveness, which immediately sounded far more interesting than our usual presentations. During the assembly, things began as expected, but then he started describing how he became radicalized by the racial inequality he experienced in South Africa. He skipped over several decades, and suddenly he was explaining how he had become the head of the Azanian People's Liberation Army, an organization classified as a terrorist group by both the United States and South African governments. He told us how he personally ordered attacks on white civilians in retaliation for government policies and spoke about forgiveness by sharing the story of a mother who forgave him for her child's death. Afterward, I did some research and discovered that he had ordered the St. James Church massacre, where his men threw grenades and opened fire on people attending a church service, killing 11 and injuring 49. In another attack, he ordered the murder of 5 white schoolchildren. During the assembly, he said that he left the organization because he had reformed and regretted his methods, but in reality, he was expelled for alleged financial misconduct. I still can't understand how our school thought it was appropriate to invite a man like that, a self-admitted war criminal, to give a talk to students about doing the right thing and forgiveness. Story 19. I grew up in a small town in the southern United States, living in a house that only had window air conditioners, no central air. I shared a bedroom with my older brother. I slept on the bottom bunk, and he slept on the top. I was 5 years old and he was 8. One night in the early 1990s, we went to sleep like normal. In the middle of the night, my brother woke up needing to use the bathroom. He climbed down the ladder and froze when he saw a man's arm sticking out from underneath the bottom bunk, right next to me. He quietly went to pee, then immediately woke up my dad. My dad thought he was just having a dream, but he checked anyway, peeked into our room, and sure enough, there was a man sleeping under my bed. The intruder had removed the window air conditioner, crawled through the opening, and carefully replaced it afterward. My dad armed himself, called the police, and kept watch from the hallway. The small-town police showed up fast and treated it like a full-blown hostage rescue. They stormed the room, pulled the man out from under the bed, and arrested him. At first, we were told he was just a drunk who thought he was sneaking back into his own house without waking his wife. Fast forward 35 years, I mentioned it to my dad recently and he said, "Oh, I guess I never told you the real story." It turns out the man had been staying in a motel across the street. After arresting him, the police illegally searched his room and found it filled with child pornography, including photos of sleeping children. Despite that, he was only charged with misdemeanor trespassing and released. Story 20. From my own personal experience, when I was 16 or 17, I drove over to my friend's house to pick him up before heading to a movie around 8 in the evening. As I drove away from his street, I noticed a man kneeling behind a parked car near his house. I told my friend, "Hey, did you see that?" There was a man behind that car. My buddy looked at me and said, "No, why would there be someone behind a car?" I told him I was certain I saw someone, but this was before everyone had cell phones, so neither of us had a way to call his parents to warn them or ask them to check outside. Keep in mind he lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing like that ever happened. So of course he thought I was imagining things or messing with him. We forgot about it and went to the movies, had a good time, and came back around midnight. When we returned, there were police cars with flashing lights all around his street. We got out of the car and discovered that his neighbor's house had been broken into and the burglar had been shot in the process. The police said the man had a bag full of rope and tape, clearly planning to use it on whoever was inside that house. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was terrified to go outside at night without checking every corner for someone hiding. It haunted me that I had seen the guy and couldn't warn anyone, all because I didn't have a phone and didn't trust myself enough to insist something was wrong. Story 21, I wouldn't say this story is scary, but it's definitely wild. A guy from my hometown, who was in my grade in high school, was hailed as a hero after saving someone from a burning house when it exploded. The story that made the news was that there was a meth lab in the garage. It blew up, and half the house was destroyed, with the top floor collapsing onto the lawn in flames. This guy supposedly smashed through a second-story window and pulled out an elderly woman who had been renting a room from the meth lab owners. The news portrayed him as a local hero, but the part nobody talked about, which I heard from people who actually knew the full story, was that he hadn't been there by chance. He was going through the neighborhood stealing from people's garages. When he broke into that particular garage, the meth lab exploded, throwing him backward about 20 feet. He panicked when he heard someone screaming inside the burning house and ran in to save her, which is definitely commendable, but not exactly how the story was told. I believe the rumor because about a month earlier, my brother's friend caught someone stealing a skateboard out of his garage, and it was the same guy. Story 22. It's either the entire chaotic saga of Donald Trump's life, or this kid from my Catholic youth group who murdered his parents with an axe on a snowy night just before Christmas. He chased his mother through the snow-covered woods in her nightgown before bludgeoning her to death. As awful as it sounds, people said his parents had been extremely abusive and manipulative, strict in a strange, controlling way. They had adopted 3 children and constantly threatened them with their adoption papers. I went to their house once, and we weren't even allowed to make a splash in their swimming pool. His name was Larry Swartz. Neil Patrick Harris actually played him in a made-for-television movie about the case called Sudden Fury, which was also the title of a book written about it. It was surreal because both Larry and one of his brothers were of Indian descent, but Neil Patrick Harris obviously wasn't. When the murders happened, our entire youth group was shocked. We attended support sessions, prayer circles, and even the funeral mass. A few days later, Larry confessed to the killings. My best friend's mom, who later became a famous mystery novelist known for her Hannah Ives series, said right away after reading the news, he's guilty. I had defended Larry because I'd gone to youth group with him. His little sister, who was of Asian descent, was adopted by another family we knew. Larry served 2 concurrent 9-year sentences and eventually moved to Florida after his release, but he died young from a heart condition. One of his brothers also later murdered someone, a taxi driver, over a jar of quarters, if I remember correctly. As strange as it sounds, Larry was still a better man than Donald Trump ever was. Story 23. My sister got engaged and eventually met her fiancé's family. His mother came from a more conservative, upper-class background, while his father was from the wrong side of the tracks, more blue-collar and down-to-earth. The 2 parents had been separated for years. The father was an extremely kind, genuine man, while the mother was cold, judgmental, and unpleasant. One afternoon, my sister was at the mother's house having tea with her fiancé, his brother, and their mother. We're Canadian, and his family was American, from a rural, very conservative area. During the visit, the brother suddenly started ranting about Canada's healthcare system, socialism and communism, getting increasingly agitated until he began throwing chairs. His mother just sat there sipping her tea, unfazed, while my sister was completely horrified. Her fiancé was furious and afterward wanted nothing to do with his mother or brother. A few years later, that same brother went on a shooting rampage and killed several women. According to his journals, he was deeply misogynistic, essentially an incel long before the term existed. He even wrote about my sister, calling her his brother's trophy wife, and ranting about how unfair it was that women didn't like him. Story 24. One night, when my friend and I were in 9th grade, he was staying at my house for the weekend. He needed to cut weight for wrestling, so we decided to go for a late-night run around 10 at night, even though it was late December in Minnesota, and there were about 8 inches of fresh snow. Toward the end of the run, we reached a dead-end street that we usually used to turn around. There was an old Jeep idling there in the middle of the road, and something about it immediately gave me bad vibes. I told my friend we should turn around early, but he brushed it off and said it was fine. As we passed the Jeep, the driver suddenly slammed it into gear and accelerated straight toward us. If it hadn't been for the deep snow, he would have hit us. We sprinted toward my house, still a couple of blocks away, with the guy chasing us. Because of the snow piled along the streets, we had to stay on the sidewalks. And during that time, the driver rammed into the snowbanks beside us 5 times trying to hit us. When we finally reached my house, the guy pulled into our yard and started spinning his tires. My older brother, who was 19 at the time, grabbed an unloaded shotgun from my dad's gun safe, went outside, pumped it, and aimed it at the Jeep. The driver sped off, running over our mailbox in the process. But my brother managed to get the license plate number. We called the police, but they didn't do anything. They assumed we had provoked the man somehow, or that it was a prank. Despite giving them the plate number, we never heard another word about it. My friend and I never went for a night run again, and we never saw that Jeep again. Story 25. Dean Corll, known as the Candyman, was one of the most sadistic serial killers in history, arguably worse than most fictional monsters ever imagined. He was notorious for kidnapping teenage boys, torturing and slowly assaulting them before killing them. He built what he called a torture board, designed so that victims could be tied to either side, and on several occasions, he tortured 2 victims at once, sometimes brothers. His methods were horrifyingly ritualistic and repeated. One included inserting a glass rod into his victim's genitals before shattering it. Corll wasn't a loner either. He manipulated and convinced other teenage boys to help him lure victims, telling one accomplice that they were assisting in a slave business. Eventually, that accomplice became so desensitized that he continued helping willingly. Investigators later found evidence suggesting that Coral was connected to a nationwide pedophile network, given the enormous amount of child pornography in his possession, some of which he produced himself. Only about 3 years of his crimes are well documented from the period when he worked with accomplices. What happened before that is largely unknown. Many victims remain unidentified, known only through photographs Coral took during or after the torture. He was finally stopped when one of his accomplices shot and killed him. Coral had flown into a rage after the accomplice brought a girl to his house, screaming that the perfect setup was ruined. In self-defense, the accomplice turned on him and shot him dead. If not for that, Coral likely would have continued for many more years. The police had been nowhere close to catching him. There's almost nothing in human history that matches the sheer cruelty of what he did. And the terrifying part is that someone with the same means and motives could easily exist again today. Story 26. A woman from my hometown was brutally murdered at a house party hosted by a local dentist. She was stabbed in the head and neck 11 times, with part of the knife blade breaking off inside her spine. The first call made after the discovery of her body wasn't to emergency services, but to the chief of police. A close friend of the homeowner, a well-connected man with influence across the city. The chief arrived before anyone else and is widely believed to have tampered with the crime scene. When the state police came in the following morning to investigate, one of the city officers told them it looked like the woman had died from a brain aneurysm. The chief of police conveniently retired the very next day. Everyone who was in the house at the time of the murder is publicly known, and the names are on record, but no arrests were ever made, no charges filed, and no official explanation given. Years have passed, and it's likely nothing will ever come of it. It's insane to think that someone could be killed so savagely in such a public way, and yet the entire town just collectively decided to forget about it. Story 27. This one is personal because it happened to me. The details are blurry, but I was about 7 years old when my mom's obsessive ex-boyfriend kidnapped me. I was staying with my mom for the week, and we both needed a ride somewhere, so she called him. Probably the worst decision she could have made. He drove us out to some place I didn't recognize, and they started arguing. I think it was his house, because at one point he told me to go inside and eat some chips while they fought outside. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually he came in alone, acting totally calm and friendly. My mom was nowhere to be seen. I kept asking where she was, but he wouldn't answer me. For the next few days, I just sort of lived with him. He talked to me, made food, and let me watch television, but otherwise acted like nothing was wrong. I was getting more anxious because I had no idea where my mom was, and the house was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, so I was too scared to leave. I started noticing strange things. The van that had been outside was suddenly gone, and he'd disappear for hours before coming back like nothing had happened. After about 4 days, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to someone shaking me on the couch. It was my mom. She whispered for me to stay quiet, half carried me outside, and we hurried through the woods. Eventually, we reached the van I hadn't seen since she'd vanished. She started it. I don't know how she got the keys. Maybe he'd left them out, and drove us away as fast as she could. We stopped at the first house we saw and used their phone to call the police. I learned later that after their argument, he had strangled my mom until she passed out, then tied her up and kept her trapped in the woods for days. He visited her to torture her, all while I was inside his house, completely unaware. Even though my mom has her flaws and hasn't been a good person for most of my life, what she went through still makes my skin crawl. What haunts me most, though, is how normal he seemed to me. He wasn't cruel or violent toward me, just unsettlingly calm, as if I was a kid he suddenly had to take care of. I sometimes wonder why he didn't hurt me. Maybe he thought about it and changed his mind. Maybe I don't want to know. I've lived through a lot of dark things, but that memory still feels like something ripped out of a nightmare. Too real to forget, too horrifying to fully understand. Story 28. An elderly man once visited his wife, who was living in a senior home, on her birthday. He hugged and kissed her, told her he had a present in the car, and stepped outside to get it. Moments later, he returned with a loaded gun and shot her in the head on the front steps of the building. There's still a stain on those steps to this day, and I swear I'll never set foot on that property again. I dated the granddaughter of the owner and spent a few nights there with her. The place was ancient. I found record books dating back to the Civil War and even saw an old leather executioner's coat hanging stiff on a hook in the records room. The basement had 2 levels. The upper level was lined with jail cells once used to confine the mentally ill, and the lower level held the massive boilers that heated the place, and, I suspect, much darker secrets. The barn had a rocking chair that never stopped moving, no matter the time of day. The butcher's shed stayed freezing cold in the middle of August. I saw things fly across rooms without explanation, and every day around the same time, the piano would play a few lonely keys by itself. Without a doubt, it was the most haunted place I've ever been in my life. Story 29. One of my mother's senior students went missing in 2017 and wasn't found for over a month. She was last seen being picked up by a group of suspicious men in a car, and after that, she vanished. She stopped coming to school, and weeks passed before anyone officially reported her missing. Eventually, investigators discovered that her estranged older brother had orchestrated her murder over a dispute involving their mother's will. He had always been violent and unstable, skipping school and getting into trouble until he dropped out entirely. On the day of the murder, he and a couple of friends picked her up after she finished an exam. They had set her up. They drove her to a secluded area where they assaulted her, beat her, and bludgeoned her with a hammer before strangling her. When she was dead, they tied a plastic bag over her head and dumped her body in a shallow grave. To hide the smell of decomposition, they killed 2 dogs and left their bodies nearby to mask the scent. It was one of the most horrific and senseless crimes I've ever heard about, made even worse by the betrayal. A brother murdering his own sister for greed. Story 30. In September of 2002, in Boulder, Colorado, the same city forever linked to the unsolved JonBenet Ramsey case, there was another brutal killing that still haunts the town. A man named Robert Powers walked into an Old Navy store carrying a butcher knife and slaughtered a teenage girl working there. Then he calmly walked outside, sat down on the curb with the blood-covered knife beside him, and waited for the police to arrive. Powers had previously been imprisoned for robbery and had spent the last 16 months of his sentence in solitary confinement after repeatedly assaulting his cellmate. He was labeled a serious threat to the safety and security of the prison, yet was still released on mandatory parole just 3 months before the murder. What makes the story even more twisted is what led up to the killing. After his release, Powers developed a secret romantic relationship with the victim's father, Herman Fuentes, whom he met at an adult bookstore. Fuentes eventually decided to end the affair and sought a restraining order against Powers. The very next day, Powers bought a knife from the Target across the street, walked into the Old Navy where Fuentes' daughter worked, and murdered her. When questioned, Powers said, "I wanted to take what was most precious to him. I would have wiped out the whole Fuentes family if I could get a gun. I was living in Boulder on Christmas Day 1996, the day JonBenet Ramsey was found dead, about 10 blocks from her home. That memory already cast a dark shadow over the city, but hearing about this murder years later chilled me to the bone. Unlike the Ramsey case, which remains unsolved, this one ended with absolute certainty, a confession, a motive, and a horror that felt all too real." Story 31. About 13 years ago, I was interning for a kind and generous man who owned his own accounting firm. We always took the week between Christmas and New Year's Day off. The day I was supposed to return to work, I came down with something and decided to call him to let him know I wouldn't be in. He didn't answer. I tried again later that day, and the next day, and again over the weekend. Still nothing. He never returned my calls. Something in my gut told me something was wrong, so when I went back to the office the following Monday, I asked my husband to come with me. When I got there, I found a note on my desk from the other woman who worked there part-time. It simply said, "Please call me." My stomach dropped. When I called her, she told me that our boss had passed away. He had shot himself in the chest at home. His doctor had recently changed his mental health medication, and he had spiraled. The thought that chilled me most was that he kept a gun in his office. If he'd had a breakdown during work hours, he could have killed me, the other woman, and himself. He wasn't a mean or dangerous person, just someone battling something he couldn't control. Later, the part-time employee told me that he'd once had a small breakdown after work one day. She had tried to take him to the hospital, but he refused. and even jumped out of her car. When she called him later that evening, he seemed fine. That wasn't the night he died, but looking back, it was probably a warning sign. She had done everything she could to help him, but in the end, there was nothing more she could do. Sometimes people just lose themselves to the pain, and no one can pull them back. Story 32. My family actually experienced a lot of paranormal activity. When my mom was pregnant, she said she saw the spirit of her father come through the window of our house one night. She believed that if he touched her, she would die. She survived, but the baby she was carrying, my younger sister-to-be, was stillborn. Strange things kept happening after that. I was only about 6 years old, but I remember that house vividly. I couldn't sleep at night, so I'd stare out the window. One night, long after midnight, I saw two figures looking back in at me. Their faces were strange, their shapes almost human, but not quite. It took me a few seconds to realize what I was seeing before I screamed for my parents. My dad ran outside, but there was nothing there. Later, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were two native men dressed for a powwow nearby, but deep down I knew they weren't. They moved wrong, looked wrong. Sometimes I wondered if they were Bigfoots, because what I remembered matched those descriptions too. When we moved to a 2-story house, the noises continued. We'd hear footsteps upstairs even when no one was there. One summer day, we heard it again. My brother went up the back stairs, old, creaky, but sturdy, while I went up the front. Halfway up, two men came down the stairs. They looked like Native Americans and said they were looking for their friends, apologizing for not realizing both floors were occupied. They walked out the door and we followed right behind them. But by the time we stepped outside, they were gone, completely vanished. We looked everywhere, north, south, across the street, even behind the house. But there was no trace of them. They disappeared into thin air. I grew up believing in ghosts after that, absolutely certain they exist. When I worked night shifts years later, I'd often get that prickling feeling, my hair standing on end, as I walked to my car in the early morning. That was my cue to hurry. Some spirits I always felt were friendly, but others, like whatever haunted that house, gave off something darker. I'd always circle around the house in my car before leaving, making sure my parents were safe. I never saw anything again, but the feeling, that cold, unseen presence, never really left me. Story 33. About 2 years ago, I was hanging out at my dad's house with his wife and her kids when he suddenly decided we should go visit his father's grave. Knowing how much my dad loves anything paranormal, I already suspected he'd want to stay there for a while. But I agreed anyway. When we arrived, we started walking around the graveyard, and my dad noticed that a flower pot had fallen over, spilling the flowers onto the ground. He bent down to pick up the small ceramic cup-like holder and place the flower back inside it. The moment he did, his spirit box, one of those devices that supposedly lets spirits communicate, blared the word no, and the flower pot flipped right back over by itself. I honestly thought he was pulling some kind of trick and brushed it off. But then I started seeing shapes in the darkness between the trees, faint human-like figures that seemed to peek out and vanish whenever I tried to focus on them. It freaked me out more than I wanted to admit. As we were leaving, my dad suggested taking a picture beside my grandfather's grave. It was already pretty late, so we used the camera flash. The four of us, me, my dad, and my two younger brothers, stood in a line and smiled for the picture. Later, when we looked at the photo, we noticed something strange. At about waist level, there was a small face in the frame, clear enough to make out features. It looked exactly like my grandfather. My dad pulled out his father's old ID and held it beside the image, and I swear they were identical. Every line, every shadow. It gave me chills then, and even now, thinking about it, I still get goosebumps. I'm pretty sure I still have that picture on one of my old phones, and it's one of the creepiest, most unexplainable things that's ever happened to me. Story 34. When I was 8, my dad used to take me four-wheeling at different spots where a lot of people rode ATVs. One day we went to a place right next to a busy highway. You had to drive a truck down a steep dirt hill and park under a bridge to get there. It was basically off-road heaven. Hills, smooth paths, and gorgeous views the farther you went from the main road. After exploring for a while, my dad noticed a narrow dirt trail cutting through the trees, barely wide enough for us to fit. Of course, he decided we should see where it led. We drove down the path until we noticed something white lying on the ground up ahead. Curious, we moved closer. When we were about 10 feet away, my dad suddenly slammed on the brakes and yelled, "Cover your eyes!" I did as he said, but then I heard the engine roar as he spun the four-wheeler around and sped off. I couldn't help glancing back, and what I saw still haunts me. There was a body wrapped tightly in plastic trash bags, and just beyond it, someone, was running toward us through the trees. My dad floored it, and we got out of there fast. When we reached the truck, we loaded up and left without saying a word. I tried to ask him about it later, but he told me not to say anything to anyone because it could be dangerous. I didn't fully understand back then, but I think he just didn't want anyone linking us to what we saw. A few weeks later, my dad told me that the area had been closed off by authorities and declared off limits to the public. I guess someone else found what we did and reported it. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if my dad hadn't reacted as fast as he did. Because whoever killed that person had been there, watching us, ready to make sure no one left alive. Story 35, I was almost kidnapped twice as a child. The first time I was about 5 years old, shopping with my mother in a retail store. Out of nowhere, an African woman took my hand and started leading me toward the exit. She was nearly out the door with me before my mother noticed. Thankfully, the security staff were quick to react and stopped her before she could get away. I don't remember any of it myself, but my mother never forgot. The second time, I was walking from my grandfather's house to the nearby shops. Up ahead, I noticed a white panel van with its windows painted over. I didn't think much of it at first and kept walking. Suddenly, the side door slid open and two African men jumped out and started running straight at me. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. I leapt over walls and hedges, finally diving behind a thick bush. From there, I could see their legs as they searched for me. After what felt like forever, they gave up and ran off. I sprinted home and told my grandfather everything. He went out looking for the van but couldn't find it. I can still see it all clearly, even now. What makes it terrifying is that this happened in apartheid-era South Africa, the late 1970s or early 1980s. There's no way those men were trying to adopt me, and it's unlikely it was a kidnapping for ransom or abuse, given how dangerous it would have been for black men to keep a white child at that time. The only conclusion that makes sense is that I was targeted for muti, traditional medicine made from human body parts. My pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes would have made me a valuable target in that horrific trade. Even 40 years later, I still shudder thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't escaped. Story 36, I'm a professional ballet dancer and have been dancing for 15 years. When I was around 10 or 11, I joined my local ballet studio's summer program to stay in shape and work on my technique. During the week, we rehearsed a few short pieces that we'd perform for our parents on the final day. That last day, about half an hour before our performance, a SWAT team burst into our studio and told us to evacuate immediately. We quickly grabbed our things and were escorted to another building a block away. Many of us wanted to leave, but the police had locked down the entire area. We ended up stuck there for about 5 hours, and when it became clear the lockdown wouldn't end soon, we decided to perform anyway, in a narrow hallway of the office building where we were sheltering. Later, when we were finally allowed to go home, we learned what had happened. The bank next door to our studio was being robbed, and the robbers had taken hostages. They threatened to blow up the building if their demands weren't met, though no one seemed to know what they actually wanted. My dad later showed me photos of armored vehicles, police snipers, and officers in full gear surrounding the building. In the end, the robbers were all killed, and we were allowed to go home safely. To this day, I don't know if they ever had explosives or if it was just a bluff, but every time I think back to that strange, tense day when our ballet show turned into an unplanned hostage lockdown, I still get chills. Sometimes I joke with my friends that it was the most dramatic performance I've ever been part of. Story 37. When I was in my late 20s, I worked the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store and gas station. I did that same shift for a couple of years and nothing truly bad ever happened. Just the occasional shoplifter grabbing a chocolate bar or some small item. Because of where the store was located, right on the edge of town, there were long stretches of time when not a single customer would come in. Eventually, a day shift position opened up and I jumped at the chance to take it. They hired a new woman to replace me for nights, and I trained her for 5 shifts before I switched to days. On her very first solo night shift, the store was robbed at gunpoint. The safe and deposit drawers had time delay locks, so she couldn't open them even if she wanted to. While she pretended to start the timer, she hit the silent alarm. The robbers fled before the safes opened and were never caught. She was badly shaken but physically unharmed. She went home to rest after the ordeal. The next night, she didn't show up for her shift. No one blamed her. After being robbed at gunpoint, most people wouldn't want to go back. But when she didn't answer calls the next morning or show up the following night, my manager started to get worried. She drove to the woman's apartment and heard her dogs barking inside. The woman's car was still in the driveway, but no one came to the door. The manager called the police for a wellness check. When officers entered, they found her dead in bed. She'd suffered a heart attack sometime after going home from that terrifying night. I still feel guilty about it. It should have been me working that shift. Story 38. About 25 years ago, I worked part-time at an arcade that was a second home to a lot of rough kids who didn't have great lives. One night, a guy in his early 20s walked in with a small group of teens following him like he was their leader. It was obvious he was in charge, the kind of guy who didn't have to say much to make everyone else fall in line. After a while, they started trashing their area, knocking things over, spilling drinks, making a mess. So I went over and told them to stop. The leader gave me a cold, dead stare, one that said I was less than nothing to him. I met his eyes for a moment, then went back to the counter. That look stayed with me. It wasn't posturing, it was something darker. Later, after they left and I was cleaning up, I found a single bullet standing upright in an ashtray, right where they had been sitting. I didn't need to ask who left it. I knew. About a year later, I heard that same guy had shot and killed 3 people and gone on the run. The police found him after several days. After his arrest, a few kids whispered that he'd probably killed before, but no one had ever dared report him. Everyone had been too afraid. When I think back to that look he gave me that night, I realize it wasn't just menace or attitude. It was the look of someone who had already crossed that line, someone capable of murder. I was just lucky I caught him on a day when he didn't feel like proving it. Story 39. During one summer in my teens, I worked at a scout camp. I loved it, being outdoors, teaching kids, and being one of the few women on staff. There were 2 guys I worked closely with that year. The first was a 17-year-old on my staff. He was funny, hardworking, and a little awkward, but a good kid overall. Years later, after I'd moved on from scouting, I was sitting at home with my husband and our newborn, watching the evening news when his face appeared on the screen. He'd robbed a bank at gunpoint. What made it stranger was that he'd just gotten married months earlier. And after the robbery, he left the state without his new wife. He was eventually caught at Disneyland when someone recognized him. He served time and, surprisingly, seems to have turned his life around since getting out. The other guy from camp was also an area director. He was odd, told weird lies like claiming to be related to Aaron Carter, which kind of made sense since he had a binder full of the singer's pictures. He also said he had an 8-year-old son, though he was only about 21, and no one believed him. Later that summer, his troop came to camp, and he spent a lot of time with one of the younger boys. After the season ended, I ran into him at the grocery store where I worked, 45 minutes from his town, and he had that same 12-year-old scout with him. It felt wrong, but since the boy's parents supposedly knew, I didn't say anything. A few months later, he started calling me constantly, trying to hang out, until my fiancé finally told him to back off. Not long after, I got a message from someone asking if I'd seen the news. He'd been arrested for multiple felony charges of child sexual abuse. The boy he'd been grooming was the same one I'd seen with him. His parents had found explicit texts between them. I was stunned. It's horrifying to think someone I worked beside, someone I laughed with, could be capable of something so disgusting. I still thank God he was caught before he could hurt anyone else.